Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Beroe's. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Beroe's third webinar session for this quarter. Our topic today will be Renewable Fuel Standards Mandate and Genetically Modified Corn Rejection. Is it a double whammy? So throughout the course of this presentation, we're going to be using the term RFS for Renewable Fuel Standard and GMO for genetically modified corn. Before we begin, as always, a set of instructions. If you would like to post a question anytime during the presentations, you will see on the Go-To panel the questions column indicated in the rectangular red box here. You can type your questions in here and press the send button, and I will review your moderator the questions, and I will ask it appropriately at the right interval over the course of the presentation. If you are having any issues logging in, we suggest that you close the Go-To window and go to your inbox where you got the invitation and click on the web link there. In case of any other issues, you can email our marketing people. His name is Puneet. His email is mentioned here. The same email is also in the invitation that was sent to your inbox. So let me quickly introduce our speaker for today. His name is Govind, and he is from the Agro division of Beroe, Agro Research and Commodities. He specializes specifically in the food sector, and he holds a triple master's, and he's been with Beroe catering to all Fortune 100 clients from the food sector. Shri will be your moderator, and I will be taking your questions as the presentation prolongs. So without further ado, let me pass the presentation to Govind. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Shri. Good day to all. My name is Govind, and I'll be taking you through this presentation. Now, the object of this webinar is essentially to determine where the US corn market is headed towards a decade from now. And in order to determine this, we are going to be focusing on two key issues that are currently trending in the corn market. One is the proposed reduction in the Renewable Fuel Standard, Rfs Mandate, and two, the rejection of genetically modified corn, GMO corn, by China. Is this a double whammy or is it not? That's the focus of this webinar. Now, how we arrive at our conclusion and what is in it for us as procurement people forms the crux of my presentation. With that, on with the show. So let's start with the first of the two issues, which is the Rfs Mandate. The issue as it is now is that the Energy Policy Act introduced this RFS program in 2005 and expanded it in 2007 to include corn ethanol. It essentially determines the amount of corn ethanol that is to be blended with gasoline, and therefore determines the amount of corn that is going to be diverted to ethanol. Now currently there is a proposal to reduce this mandate, and the reason why it is being done so is because there are certain claims made by the National Council of Chain Restaurants that ever since the RFS mandate was introduced, food prices have risen due to an increase in corn prices, obviously because corn was diverted to ethanol. Now, whether these claims are true or not is not our focus. Whatever it is, the key takeaway is this, that the proposal to reduce the mandate has happened, that currently corn is in oversupply in the US and corn prices are falling. So it's actually a bad time to cause any reduction in corn demand. So we are going to look at whether this proposal is going to be implemented, and if so, what is the impact in the future. And moving on to the next slide. So the proposal to reduce the mandate will be addressed now. The previous target was initially 14 billion gallons of corn ethanol to be blended with gasoline in 2014. Now, with the proposal to reduce this mandate, the proposed target is that only 13.01 billion gallons of corn ethanol will be blended with gasoline in 2014. Now, as far as this proposal is concerned, my analysis is that this will definitely happen. And the reason why is because the NCCR is NCCR basically has some valid reasons that they're putting forth from their perspective. And one thing that they are pointing out is that the very fact that the EPA has made a proposal to reduce the mandate shows that there is something wrong with the mandate. So there is some pressure on the for the EPA to reduce this mandate. But this is not the real problem because this reduction is quite minimal. What we are looking at though is a long-term perspective, and that would mean that within the, let's say, a decade from now, there could be a potential reduction in the Rfs mandate to to around 10 to 10.8 billion gallons. Why do I say this? Well, there is yet another party joining the fray. Certain environmental activists have claimed on the basis of research conducted that corn ethanol could be damaging to the environment. And according to a particular law, the EPA, the Energy Policy Act, has the ability to has the power, to waive any mandate that is construed to be environmentally damaging. And that, coupled with the pressure exerted by the NCCR, would definitely mean that this mandate could be potentially reduced to 10 to 10.8 billion gallons by, say, 2020 to 22. And therefore, we must now focus on how this will affect the corn market if such a reduction is made. This is quite a significant reduction, as we will see. So I would invite you now to take a look at the projected corn use for ethanol, which is stated in million metric tons. In 2013, 13.8 billion gallons of corn ethanol were produced, and that warranted 127 million metric tons of corn going into ethanol. Now, if we assume that in 2014, the 13.01 billion gallon target is met, this would be the amount of corn going into ethanol as per my estimates. And if we go a decade from now, and we assume that there will be, and this is, I definitely feel in the very positive, that there will be a reduction to 10 to 10.8 billion gallons, this would be the amount of corn going into ethanol. Now, I would like to invite your attention to the two figures, 127 million metric tons and 100 million metric tons. This is a clear reduction of 27 million metric tons of corn. So the irrefutable conclusion of this estimate would be that the Rfs mandate reduction could cause a 27 million metric ton of excess supply of corn for the US a decade from now. At this juncture, you may ask me certain questions. Have you actually considered the acreage and production factors in your estimates? Well, the answer is yes, I have. But before we come to that, let us get a clearer picture of all the estimates and analysis together. And after that, we can address the acreage factor. I therefore request the audience to bear with me and go with the analysis for now, and I'll come to that acreage issue later. So moving on. We have estimated that the US could land up with 27 million metric tons of excess supply in a decade from now. What can they do with it? The obvious solution would be they can export it. But can they? Because we need to study the US export market to be sure, or sorry, the global export market in particular. So, and that's what we'll be doing in this slide. As you can see, when it comes to the global corn exports market, news is not all that good for US. The average US export share, which was 52% for 10 years, has now declined to 33%, despite the US still dominating globally. And the reason? It's because of the competition. And who are the competitors? I'd like the audience to focus only on the countries and the percentages of the export share given in brackets, because that itself is enough to give you the whole picture. It is very clear from these numbers that these countries are emerging competitors, and by a decade from now, they could be very serious rivals for the US. And all these countries, the US included, are targeting one major importer of corn, and that country is China. And at the moment now, China is the major export destination for US. How can I be sure? Well, the facts speak for themselves. If we study the percentage of US corn exports going to China, I would like to invite your attention to the bars. Please take a look at the percentage of US corn exports in 2010 to 11 going to China. Now, please take a look at the trend in the subsequent years. The bars themselves speak the story. It's been progressively increasing. And going by these trends, we can easily say that if things remain the same, then a decade from now, a quarter of US corn exports could be going to China. But will things actually remain the same? And this is where the GMO corn rejections come in. We have to study the motive behind rejections of genetically modified corn by China. Is there more than just generic corn in the offing? That's what we'll address next. So we now come to the second part of the webinar, which is the rejection of genetically modified corn by China. The issue is briefly summarized as thus. 600,000 metric ton approximately of a genetically modified strain of corn known as MIR 162 has been rejected by China. This assumes significance because of the facts that we saw earlier with respect to the US-China trade, and also that 98% of Chinese imports of corn are from US. Obviously, the MIR 162 strain is not very toxic or adverse in any manner because other countries like South Korea, Japan, and EU also import it. So as far as the short term is concerned, we do not predict that there will be much of an impact because this strain is subject for approval by July 2014 at the latest. So this will not cause much problems to the US after that. But my analysis deals with the long-term outlook, and I feel that this rejection of GMO corn by China is an indicator for a more long-term outlook, in that this rejection is a strategy based on an ulterior motive by China, in that they want to move away from their dependence on the US. They want to diversify their imports and look for other options besides the US. The reason why I say this? Well, if you look at the timing, these rejections come at a time when China is driving towards self-sufficiency, although there is an import demand, which I'll explain later. These rejections come at a time when China has imported corn from Ukraine and Argentina for the first time in history. About 50 to 60 K metric tons of corn have been imported from these two countries for the first time. These rejections come at a time when the Chinese government has made certain cryptic statements. They say that a combination of domestic and foreign resources is inevitable for China to cater to Chinese corn demand. Please examine this statement closely. A combination of domestic resources. This obviously implies self-sufficiency drive. And foreign resources. This comes at a time when they rejected US corn and imported from Ukraine and Argentina. Clearly shows that they are very keen on diversifying their imports and moving away from US dependency. Now you may ask a question. Why would they want to do that? US corn is cheap. US corn is abundant. So what could be the rationale? Once again, there are three indicators. Now, although China is 95% self-sufficient, I mentioned that they have a very healthy import demand for corn. The reason? It's because the domestic corn floor price is set at 367 USD per ton. What this means is that if the domestic corn prices fall below this level, then the Chinese government is bound to buy all the corn from the farmers. They don't want to do that. So they artificially elevate the prices above this level and keep the Chinese corn prices far above the global prices. From the domestic producer's point of view, this means that they would look to import corn to cut costs. And when they think of imports, they naturally think of the US first of all. And when they think of the US, they mainly think of the 2012 drought, because during the 2012, when there was a drought in the US, the amount of US corn that was exported to China drastically reduced. And this has caused some fear among the Chinese. They feel that if this happens again, it would be disastrous considering the rising demand. And obviously they want to avoid such a situation. And the safest alternative is that they want to diversify their imports and reduce their dependency on US. And that is the irrefutable conclusion of this whole GMO corn rejection scenario. Now we have established that they do want to diversify their imports. The question now is, can they, and how will they do it? Well, obviously they can, because we studied the export market and determined that Ukraine, Argentina, and Brazil are viable alternatives. But let's make some projections for 2020 to 22. It is estimated that the Chinese demand for corn imports would rise to 20 million metric tons by 2020. If that happens, that's fine. I agree with that analysis actually. Now, let's take a look at certain statements that Brazil, Ukraine, and Argentina have made. Brazil say that they want to export 10 million metric tons of corn per year to China a decade from now. Ukraine 5 to 6 million metric tons of corn per year. Argentina, 1 million metric ton of corn per year. If we assume that all these countries are able to meet their goals and they are able to export this much amount of corn to China, then what would happen? The approximate US export share to China, which is currently 98%, would actually decline down to 18%. This is a very drastic reduction. I mean, 98 to 18. Is this even realistic? Well, obviously not. And the reason? Well, there are certain other factors we need to consider besides these. There are certain aspects going against these countries in that they are facing challenges. For one thing, let's take Ukraine, which is currently in the process of developing its agricultural and irrigational facilities. In some of these countries, the transportation costs actually outweigh the actual price of corn. And obviously, Brazil has the challenge of supply delays due to port congestions. But we do assume that these countries have some positives going for them. Firstly, they can definitely improve their condition by this turn of this decade. And also, China has shown interest in these countries. They have not only imported corn from Ukraine and Argentina, they are looking at Brazil, and they have also loaned $3.3 billion to Ukraine in order to improve their agricultural facilities. So all this show there are positives going for these countries. So what we can do now is we can compare the prices of all these countries, the prices at which the corn is trending, and determine where they will stand a decade from now. This table actually summarizes the CIF prices for all the countries and compares it to the Chinese domestic prices. Since it's very complicated, I would request your attention to only the last row. Please ignore everything else. The last row shows the projections for a decade from now based on my reasonable estimates. Even here, I would just like you to notice the fact that all the prices are trending between 215 to 230 to 240. So what we can gather from this is that a decade from now, all the prices will be pretty much similar, which means that these countries are going to be serious competition for the US. And therefore, based on the cons and pros that we have just weighed, I would summarize that the US percentage share of Chinese imports, or to rephrase, the approximate US export share to China, will not decline from 98 to 18, but reasonably from 98 to 65 to 70%. And this itself is very significant. And this is the key takeaway from the genetically modified corn rejection scenario. Now, we have looked at both the RFS and the GMO issues. Let's put them both together and get the entire estimates in hand. Let's start with GMO because we just finished it. It establishes a continuity. If we need to study the impacts that the import diversification would make in greater detail. This is the projected exports in total for US in the years 2014 and 2022. Now, if we assume that China do not diversify their imports, that they continue to be dependent on US, based on reasonable estimates, this would be the amount of corn going from US to China in 2014 and 2022. Now, if we assume that China do diversify their imports, which is obviously more likely, that they start importing from other countries as well, this would be the amount of corn going from US to China. Now, 8.4 becomes 7 in 2014. Not a big change. But if you look at this, 18 becomes 13. And we take in mind that Chinese import demand by 2022 would be around 20 million metric tons. This is a deficit of 5 million metric tons for the US. And if we remember, there is the 27 million metric tons that we calculated from the Rfs Mandate reduction. We could potentially be looking at an approximate 30 to 35 million metric tons of excess corn supply with the US by 2020 to 22. And this is a massive statement to make. At this point, you would once again ask, have you considered the acreage in production? The answer, well, yes, I have. And now we'll get to it in the next slide. And this is the acreage issue. So let's first state the facts. We know that whenever there is a fall in corn prices, obviously the tendency for farmers would be to switch to soybean in terms of acreage. So let's take a look at certain projections. This chart shows the projections for planted acreage for corn and soybean in 2014. As you can see, corn acreage is slated to decrease because of the current trend in corn prices, which is falling, and the soybean acreage is projected to rise. But if you look at the yield projections, please take a look at the corn bar. Not only is it far higher than soybean, but the yield is actually increasing despite the reduction in acreage. And that itself speaks everything very clearly. But there is more, because we predict, and I agree with an expert from the University of Illinois who actually stated this first, so all credits to him, that the 3 million acre reduction may not even happen. Reason? Well, the reason for any acreage reduction is if the corn prices are trending below soybeans. But if what he predicts is that during the time of planting, the gap between the soybean and corn prices will narrow, and the farmers may not be actually inclined to cause such a massive shift in acreage. And whether he's right or not, we need to study the bean is to corn ratio that has happened historically. The price of soybean divided by the price of corn for the months from April to June for the November and December contracts will give us an idea of whether this is true or not. And you can see in that second chart over there, please ignore all the numbers, just focus on one thing. Everything is in the 2.2 to 2.425 or 2.4 range. This shows that despite minor fluctuations, the bean to corn ratio has been fairly stable. And based on certain estimates of prices for corn and soybean in 2014 and extrapolating that to a decade from now, we can easily say that this ratio will be maintained, because in 2014 there have been estimates for corn and soybean prices, so it will be 2.43. 2020, when the US may end up with excess supplies of corn, situation may be similar to 2013, and we would have around the same ratio. So therefore, this acreage issue is actually a non-issue. The shift to acreage may not be as great as 3 million acres, and even if that happens, it's not going to affect the yield and production of corn. And USDA apparently agrees with this, because their projections, you can even ignore the harvested acreage. For 2020 to 22, they predict that the corn production is going to be 14 billion bushels. That's approximately 350 million metric tons, which is nearly the same as 2030. So this shows that that my estimates are quite solid, and I have taken the acreage factor also into consideration. And this brings us back to square one. What can the US do with 30 to 35 million metric tons of excess supply in the future? Now, I stated in the beginning of this webinar itself that we would be concluding it by talking about what's in it for us as procurement people. And that's what I'm going to focus on now. We are nearing the end of the webinar. Now, we have established that the US could potentially land up with 30 to 35 million metric tons of excess corn. What can they do with it? We have considered that the US can diversify their exports and maybe look at other countries besides China. But there would be competition even in that area. So my opinion and my analysis is that the US needs to look deep into its own internal demand. For instance, the feed and residual industry. If you look at the current corn consumption by this industry, it's 134.6 million metric tons. But if you look at the projections for 2020 made by me based on reasonable estimates of demand, it's 144.7 million metric tons. This means that there would be around 11 MMT of corn that would be extra, and this would account for part of the 30 to 35 million metric tons of excess corn. What this would imply? Well, cheaper animal feed for one. The companies that are able to process the corn into feed would definitely benefit by procuring corn at cheaper prices. This in turn would benefit the meat and poultry sector. Naturally, companies that incorporate meat ingredients into their end-use products would also benefit because the feed would be cheaper for livestock. So overall, I would say the meat and poultry sector would benefit from the advantage of procurement at lower prices. But this is not all. There are just two more markets that we need to consider which are niche for corn. and we will conclude our presentation with that. Now, the second emerging market is the sorbitol industry. As we know, sorbitol is essentially, it uses corn as a feedstock. Sorbitol is produced by global brands that are based in America, and also Asian players like China are emerging regions for sorbitol. So let's compare the price of American sorbitol with Chinese sorbitol. If you look at the price trends, currently American sorbitol is priced higher, or as per certain reports, almost equivalent to that of China. Be that as it may, competition from China is quite intense. If you take a look at the supplier share for sorbitol, 70% is consolidated and dominated by global players, most of which are based in America. But we have a 30% in the form of emerging nations from Asia, China, Thailand, and Indonesia. And going by this trend, we can easily say that the Asian share could become 50 by 2020. So what can we do? When US has excess corn, it could be diverted into sorbitol production. And the global brands can be trusted to increase their production capacities, thereby manufacturing more sorbitol and bringing down the prices. This way, they would be able to consolidate their share further and quell the competition that's arising from Asia. It's also relevant to note that Thailand and Indonesia use tapioca as feedstock, but it's only China that uses corn. So it would be possible to curb the competition with respect to sorbitol market, and that's the key takeaway. And finally, there's one more industry we can consider, which is the high fructose corn syrup industry, and this constitutes 52% of the sweetener market. High fructose corn syrup was introduced as a competitor to sugar and as a health substitute, say. But regardless of claims, consumers go for HFCS or sugar depending on price. And currently, beet sugar prices are much lower than high fructose corn syrup. So there is competition over prices. In the future, what I say is that if there is excess corn, it could be diverted into high fructose corn syrup, which would then allow for competitive pricing with sugar and thereby give a boost to this market. So in conclusion, I'd like to state that there is great potential for these end users. There's great potential for the meat and poultry sector in terms of procurement at lower prices. There's great potential for the sorbitol industry in terms of consolidating the supplier market share. There's great potential for the high fructose corn syrup in terms of competition with sugar. So actually, it's not, the double whammy is not a double whammy if the benefits are projected to be this. And that would be my ultimate takeaway from this webinar. And I thank you for your participation and look forward to any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Govind. See, interestingly, we'll go on to the questions now. I have about 4 questions. But as you already said, what's the benefit that procurement has because of all this excess corn, right? So I think the section on sorbitol and high fructose corn syrup is what's interesting our audience. So let me start off with the last questions that came up. So I think that will be more appropriate. One of the questions here is, you talked about sorbitol, right? So the question is, how is the Chinese sorbitol priced, right? Is it cheaper or the same level as the US sorbitol when you said that Chinese corn prices are higher? So essentially, does sorbitol not use corn as its feedstock? I think that's a very good question.
Thank you, Shri. That is indeed a very interesting question. In China, corn is the major feedstock for sorbitol, and in fact, it's the only feedstock for sorbitol to some extent. The reason, now it is true that Chinese corn prices are far higher than the US corn prices, but at the same time, the Chinese government has a massive stake in the sorbitol industry. They have waived taxes, such as value-added taxes for exports. They have offered subsidies, and this has helped to bring down the sorbitol production costs despite the high price of corn. And therefore, that's why we can say that Chinese are able to compete with the US in terms of sorbitol prices. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, so interestingly, not many countries in the world manufacture sorbitol. So outside the Western countries, it's only China. Can we say that?
Well, Thailand and Indonesia also manufacture sorbitol, but since tapioca is a higher price feedstock, Chinese sorbitol is growing. Furthermore, China are the biggest manufacturers of vitamin C with about 40% of the market share. So that would mean that obviously sorbitol is used in the production of vitamin C, and therefore there's a good scope for China to increase their production of sorbitol as well.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So moving on to our second question, it's on the high fructose corn syrup. So it says that you said that HFCS is battling with sugar over prices. So can you describe the current trend?
Well, as of now, we know that corn is in oversupply and the prices are decreasing. So this has helped the high fructose corn syrup market to some extent, which formed the crux of my analysis. Currently, the high fructose corn syrup is priced at approximately 32 to 33 cents per pound. And the equivalent beet sugar price is 27 cents per pound. So even though the corn prices are currently on a declining trend, the beet sugar prices are still lower than high fructose corn syrup. And my analysis is that if there is excess supply in 2020, the situation would either remain the same or it would go in favor of high fructose corn syrup in terms of lower prices. So that would benefit the competition in terms of competing with sugar.
Okay. So for the next question, let's go back to slide 11 for the benefit of our audience here. So in slide 11, you mentioned that the GMO corn rejections, that U.S. corn prices are cheaper than others, but in 2013, yearly average, the price is higher or at the same level as that of the others. Why is this the case?
I assume you refer to the CIF prices for 2013, which says that the U.S. Price is 293 USD per metric ton.
Yes.
And if you compare it to Brazil, Argentina, and Ukraine, yes, it's almost the same. Well, the reason is because it's a yearly average. The prices for U.S. were high in the first quarter of 2013, and that was due to the drought of 2012, which had some impact. But the prices progressively declined, and by the end of the year, they were nowhere near the range they were in at the beginning. But still, obviously, it counts in the yearly average, and that's why it seems as though it's high.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's the average. Got it. So the last question is actually sort of a surprise kind of question. So if we can go back to the second slide where you talked about what the restaurants claim. One of our audience is asking that you mentioned that restaurant chains claim that Rfs Mandate has raised corn prices. Is this actually true? So we know why this question might come up, because the restaurant industry is huge, in excess of $600 billion, right? So what are your comments on this?
Well, as far as the claim goes, I would say it's partly true, but partly false as well. Because if you look at the historical corn prices after the mandate was introduced, in the first year, I would say the prices kind of rose upon the introduction of the mandate because of an increase in corn ethanol production and the diversion of corn to ethanol. But progressively after that, the prices dropped despite more and more corn ethanol being produced. And this was mainly due to an increase in the corn production and acreage by the farmers. In fact, I believe around 2009 to 10, the prices were trending at around 3.52 to 3.99 USD per bushel, which is around the same level as it was before the mandate was introduced. And then once again the prices kind of rose, but that again was not due to the corn ethanol production or the diversion of corn to ethanol. It was due to the drought which hiked the prices. And as we know, currently in 2013 the prices are dropping. So in conclusion, I'd say that it may have caused an initial rise, but everything after that was due to a combination of several factors, and in fact the farmers were well in control of the price before the drought struck.
All right, thank you, sir. Okay, that wraps up our presentation for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us again. We look forward to having you in more webinars in the weeks to come. I believe we have one scheduled for next Wednesday. We hope to see you back. Thanks again, and have a great day, everyone.